Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing a pop of color and interference watercolor magic. I'm using this Birds of a Feather stamp set, and I'm using my interference inks to create a pop of color on my card. I'm going to be doing the watercolor on Distress Watercolor Cardstock. Now, this card is part of an Instagram hop called Pop of Color with Pajama Crafter Stamps. So if you're wanting to see more inspiration with cards that have a pop of color on them, I encourage you to go over to my Instagram and check that out. There'll be instructions and a list of all the people that are participating in that event. But I always love to have a video tutorial for whatever cards I'm sharing because I think it's helpful for some people. So the first thing I am doing is I have a piece of my Distress Watercolor Cardstock in my Misti stamping tool. Now, watercolor cardstock has one side that's more textured and one side that's more flat. Anytime I'm doing stamping and embossing on that watercolor cardstock, I'm using the flatter side because we're going to get a clearer stamped image. I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock, and then I'm stamping it with some VersaMark ink. And I'm going to heat emboss this with some black embossing powder. So we have a nice contrast between the black and the pop of color. I always love black with colors. I think it shows them off really, really well. So I thought a black outline for this would be perfect. But if you want something a little bit more subtle, brown embossing powder would be great as well. And you can find a few different shades of brown in the Distress Embossing Glaze line. Once I have my powder on there and I tap the excess off, I'm using my heat tool to melt that powder. Now I want to have a little bit of color in my background, a little bit of sky, but I didn't really want to watercolor that part of it for this particular card. I wanted my sky to be fairly subtle. So I have my embossed image on my sticky mat to hold it in place. And I'm using some tumbled glass distress ink with a large blending brush in order to blend that blue into the background. So for my birds here, I have 5 birds on this image. I'm using 5 different interference inks and I'm going to watercolor with them. So the first color I'm using is Summer Garden. Now I love interference inks because of their shimmery properties. They have a completely different look on black or dark cardstock than they do on white or light cardstock. I have a whole playlist with cards where I use interference inks on. So if you're looking for more ways to use them, check out that playlist. When you watercolor them, that interference shimmer is a little bit more subtle because we're adding water to it. So when I watercolor, I start around the outside edges of my images here, and then I color the whole thing in after taking some of that excess color off of my brush. Then I go back into my color on my mat here, getting as much color as possible on that brush, and I just tap it where I want that color to be darkest. Wherever I tap that and that color is darkest, that's where my interference shimmer is going to settle. We're going to get a tiny bit on the lighter areas, but we're going to get most of it on the darker areas. So I'm using that same technique for all 5 birds. The second bird there was done in pink champagne. This third one is lemon candy. So I kind of chose primary-ish and secondary-ish colors aside from the blue because we have a blue background. I wanted to see a pop of color on top of that really subtle blue background. This fourth color here is Crushed Velvet. So again, going around the outside edge, then taking the excess color off of my brush and then going back in and filling that whole area, adding more color to my brush and just tapping it into where I want that color to be darker, so where I want the shading to go. When you tap it in there, because that whole surface is wet, it's going to naturally start to blend and bleed into each other. One thing you don't see here is right to my right, I have a piece of paper towel. So if by chance I have too much color on my brush, I will wipe it off on that paper towel. If I need to change colors, I will squeeze my brush and push all of that water out there and clean out my brush. So I'm using a brush that has water right in the handle. And anytime I want to clean my brush out, I just squeeze that handle. It pushes that ink out of the brush tip and cleans it right out. So once I have all of my birds watercolored in, I let them dry completely. I went and I stamped that image onto a piece of printer paper and then quickly fussy cut it out. It doesn't need to be perfect. I wanted to add a little bit of splatter on the background. I'm using the Raven Splatter Accents. This is going to look black, but when you tilt it in the light, there's a little bit of a gold shimmer to it. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to get that splatter on the birds. So that printer paper is protecting those birds to make sure I don't get splatter on them. And like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect fussy cutting because if I get a little splatter on the outside edges, that's totally fine. I just didn't want it all over. I wanted it on the background. once I waited for that to dry, and it only takes a few moments for that to dry, it dries fairly quick. I'm using the Essential Arches die to cut an arch out of this bird image for my card front. I ended up deciding to make a arched card base for this card. I love color or shaped card bases. I think it just adds a little extra interesting element to cards, and it's something that you don't see in stores, so it's another way to make your cards unique. So I used the third largest size for my bird image. I have another piece here that is the second largest size from that Essential Arches die. I wanted to add that black around it, but I didn't want to have a black mat. I want to have a mat with one of those interference pads. So I just took my black Memento pad and just rubbed it around the outside edges just to line that in black and frame it just a little bit. Then I'm using the pink champagne interference pad to just rub around the outside edges for my mat for my card. This way that mat is going to match perfectly to one of the birds in that image on the front, and it doesn't matter what color you use. I just chose the pink because I just really love that vibrant pink there. But I love when you use the interference inks for that mat, it just makes that mat match perfectly to the image. For my card base, I have two of the largest sizes of the Essential Arches die cut out of my card base cardstock. I scored one of them at the 4.5 inch mark, folded it back and forth to make sure I had a nice hinge, and then I put some glue on top of that score mark and then glued those two pieces together. That's how easy it is to create a shaped card base, especially when you have a die that has a flat or a straight edge at the bottom, or mostly straight edge at the bottom. Then I glued my layers on top. Now, one thing that I had forgotten here is I wanted to add a little bit of ink blending to my bird layer around the outside edges. I wanted to frame it in a little bit, and I think it would add some depth to it. But I had totally forgot. I got it caught up in the moment of assembling this card and totally forgot about it. And I remembered right after I put these stickles down. So I added the stickles to the birds just around the tails, around where their wings are. The stickles are Stardust stickles, so they don't add any color. It just adds some sparkle and texture. We still have that shimmer from the interference inks, and you can see it a bit in the video here. But that sparkle from the stickles just adds a little bit of extra texture to that front. So in order to remedy my situation, because I can't do that ink blending now as is, I wait for those stickles to dry, and I'm using a sheet of Masking Magic, die cutting the same sized arch that I used for my image piece. And Masking Magic is basically like a Post-it note sheet. It has some stick to it, but it comes right off. So it's great for something like this where I want to ink blend around the edges of that arch, but I don't want to get it on my mat, and I also don't want to get it on my card base. I quickly used a Tombow marker, that was number 933, just an orange marker, just to color in the beaks of the birds, just to add a little bit of extra color there. Then I put my Masking Magic sheet right around my image piece, just to frame it off to protect the under layers there, and use some Uncharted Mariner Distress ink around it. And I definitely think this finishes it off. It just frames that piece in, adds a little bit of visual dimension, but it makes it so that that background isn't quite as flat. Sometimes when you watercolor, I find that it ends up being a little bit flat. That's one of the reasons why I tend to add stickles and glossy accents to add different textures. And we still have that different texture from those interference inks, but I love the look of those adorable little birds with a pop of color in the middle of that card. And then we have that shaped card base that makes it special as well. You'll find everything I've used listed and linked down in the description below, and please subscribe before you leave. If you'd like to see more pop of color inspiration, head over to my Instagram page. There's a whole list of people involved, and I guarantee you're going to get a lot of inspiration over there as well. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.